Let's start with that billionaire space race. It's high-profile launches leading to some questions about how space can be used in the fight against climate change. Earlier this year, NASA announcing the creation of its Earth System Observatory to discover key information related to efforts against climate change, natural disasters, and more. Joining me now is Lori Garver, co-founder of the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program, CEO of the climate nonprofit Earthrise Alliance, and former deputy administrator of NASA. Lori, quite the accolades that you have here. We're so happy to tap your brain. And with your experience at NASA, I want you to tell us a little bit about how NASA's history has evolved when it comes to climate change.
Well, truthfully, NASA has been so critical to us understanding what's happening on planet Earth, and climate has been the number one thing that we have learned through the satellite program from even the 1950s. When we first went to space with satellites, we looked back and we saw Earth. And since then, NASA has been on the cutting edge of developing sensors that measure not just temperature in the air, land, and sea, but things like ocean acidification, of course, patterns that we see that have developed over that 60 years since we have been measuring it. At least 80% of what we know that's happening to planet Earth, we know because of satellites and NASA technology have gone into those. The Earth systems are absolutely linked between all our ice, land, sea, and air. And those interactions are what NASA measures.
Let me ask you this. We mentioned the Earth System Observatory, a new initiative here. Speak to me, if you can, about that specifically and how that is helping in the fight against climate change.
So that initiative was recently announced and named, but it is really a compilation of satellites that already existed and making sure they are seen now as they should be, which is focused on climate change. You know, NASA satellites have studied things like the ozone layer, and all of this has contributed to what we know. But this new system of satellites is part of the ongoing effort and an upgrading of that effort. There's over $2 billion a year that gets spent on this out of NASA's budget, and the Biden administration announced increases to that with this program.
Let me ask you this, Lori. Over the weekend, we saw the unofficial launch to space tourism, and I think a lot of people would say it's good to open up space to more people so that they understand what else is out there. But it is a unique conversation when we think about what these rocket launches mean for the climate. What's your take on space tourism? Do you think it's the right moment to pivot into that?
So I was at the launch. I've been a proponent of commercializing space, and space tourism is just one element of that. And I'm supportive. It's not the tax dollars who are going into it. And I think, as with aviation, or for that matter, the railroads, you know, this is something that evolves. People want to expand. That's part of our human nature, and we do have to explore to survive. However, given the problems we have on the planet and our ability to manage our own resources at this point, I think the government, as it is focusing in other areas. Those space tourist areas are really, you know, non-government, as you said, billionaire activities. NASA's developed technologies that have lowered the cost of getting to space, that have lowered the size of satellites, and all those advancements allow us to better address climate change. We're now monitoring carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, methane emissions, but the same technology lowered the cost to allow people to go to space. At this point, a couple launches a year isn't going to matter for climate change, but absolutely, if over time there's thousands of launches a year, or hundreds of thousands as there are with airplanes, they are going to focus on, I'm sure, green fuels, or it's not going to be sustainable.
Lori, let me ask you this, because it is the early days of space tourism. You were at the launch over the weekend, as you mentioned, for Branson, going to the edge of space for the first time himself. Do we know the data as to how much more detrimental to the climate a rocket launch is for space tourism purposes versus a flight, for instance, a commercial flight across the country?
Sure. Rockets have a much shorter burn time, of course, than airplanes, but that immediate emissions are much stronger. Different types of rockets have different emissions. The Virgin Galactic rocket uses a plane to start, which has emissions for a longer period of time. It also depends on where in the atmosphere those emissions are being spent. So rockets are not, by and large, good for the environment in really any way. They will advance into green fuels, and they do burn a lot faster than any other form of transportation we have. So I think the advancements that we need to make for rockets are similar to what we need to make for aviation and for any kind of transportation. Sea ships emit a lot of greenhouse gases as well. There's, of course, automobiles, trucks, etc. So this is just another layer, and I think the billionaires themselves have made commitments. Each of the three billionaires, rocket billionaires at this point, are also very concerned about the environment and
Yeah.
talk a lot about addressing it. So I really think that will be developed over time as more people have the ability to go to space.
So, Lori, let me ask you this. Obviously, you're using space for good when it comes to this climate. You're the CEO of the climate nonprofit Earthrise Alliance. What are you focusing on when it comes to space and climate with that nonprofit to try to better the planet?
So at Earthrise, our mission is really to use the imagery that we have now over a 30-year history of looking at the change in our environment and identifying that for people locally. So all of this really matters at the local level. So you can identify things that have happened over just your lifetime, as far as whether you're having too much rain, too little rain, how the climate is affecting us. And we are utilizing that information to help address this with educators, with journalists, and with policymakers in Washington.
All right, Lori, so good to get your take as we kick off a space-themed week, next 2 weeks of coverage, and of course the climate. Lori Garver, co-founder of the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program, CEO of the climate nonprofit Earthrise, and former deputy administrator of NASA.